Understanding aperture. What is aperture? It's also one of the three pillars of the exposure triangle. It's also referred to as f-stop. It's actually a function of your lens, not your camera. Aperture is a diaphragm basically that will either expand for a wide opening, like you see on the lens on the left, or constrict for a narrow opening, like the lens on the right. It works just like the pupil in your eye. So where is your aperture? If you're looking at the back of your camera, it should look something like the visual on the left, with an F in front of the number. With a semi-pro or pro camera, you may only be able to see the top view. In the top view, you'll see that it's always to the right of your shutter speed and may or may not have F noted beside it. So of course we know that aperture is going to affect light, but it also has another impact that is really why we make decisions on our aperture. The visual on the left, taken at f2.8, has a shallow depth of field. That's where things are blurry in the background and only the focal plane is in focus. And that's attained by using the smaller aperture numbers, in this case f2.8. The visual on the right is a deep depth of field, and that was taken at f16. So the grass in the front, all the groomsmen, and even the barn behind are in sharp focus, and that's called a deep depth of field. So consider from the camera's point of view, all the way back to the furthest part of the image, how deep into your image is something in focus. A shallow depth of field is where you have a shallow area of focus, and conversely, a deep depth of field, you have a deep area in focus. Also note with a shallow depth of field that you can have something in the foreground out of focus until you get to the focal plane, and then the background is out of focus. So how does aperture affect light? Well, remember I said it works just like the pupil in your eye. When we go into a dark room, our pupils are going to get very big trying to get light in. And when we go out into the bright sun, our pupils shut down really small trying to block that light out. So the larger aperture openings actually give us more light. The smaller aperture openings give us less light. Now the aperture numbers might seem a little backwards at first. The smaller aperture number, like f1.4, the furthest aperture opening on the left here, is actually the large aperture opening. The larger aperture number, like f16, all the way to the right, is actually the smaller aperture opening. So if it acts just like the pupil in our eye, and we give our camera a very large opening with a small aperture number, we're getting more light. And conversely, if we shut our aperture down to a small aperture opening, large aperture number, we're going to get less light. Also remember that with f16, that smaller opening, we're going to get a deeper depth of field. Whereas with the smaller aperture number and the larger opening, we're going to get more light, but a shallow depth of field. So several things to be mindful of when we're adjusting our aperture. And it's important to understand what you're doing when you're changing your aperture, because if you were going to take a photo of 15 people and post them in 3 rows of 5 people, if your focus point lands on the first row, there'll be a nice, crisp, sharp focus. The second row, however, will start to get a little blurry, and the third row would be even blurrier than that. So to review aperture, smaller aperture numbers, wider openings, get more light into our camera. The consequence is a shallow depth of field. But sometimes that's not a consequence. If you actually want a shallow depth of field, that isn't a consequence at all. As photographers, our fight is for light. So anything that gets us light, especially without a consequence, can be expensive.